Once again, welcome this afternoon to AST's Grad Project Presentations. I'm Susan Wilhock, and I teach pastoral theology here and have the honor of teaching the Grad Project on-campus Grad Project course this year. We have two more presentations this afternoon, and I'm here to introduce David Peer, who came to AST in 2011. Right? And David is an Anglican student. I have to look at it. Sponsored by the Bishop of Fredericton. And David's project looks at men's spirituality through the lens of a monthly men's breakfast. And so I'm sure that you're just going to eat up his presentation on bacon, eggs, and pie. He told me to say that.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. And I'd like to start our time together with a story. About 15 years ago, I was living in Bath, England, and a friend of mine invited me to a community men's breakfast. The organizers had rented the entire kitchen facilities of a boys' school, a private boys' school. And if you know the English and their breakfasts, this was a feast. And they invited speakers. They had men from churches and from the community around. And it was just amazing. And for the 3 years that I had left in Bath, I really enjoyed going every month. And I was always meeting new people. Men came from everywhere, not just the churches. So it was really an ecumenical men's gathering on a scale I've never seen since. And I've always wondered whether an Anglican parish in Canada could capture some of that energy in a breakfast. Maybe that would help more men encounter Christ. And I'm constantly reminding myself, you know, what can the church do for men to have more impact in their lives? You know, recent Canadian data within the last couple of years says that there's 5 men for every 6 women in church. But if I did a little head count here before we started, and you know that there's 3 times more women than there are men in this building right now. So I don't know if the data's right, but for sure there's a difference. And the Pew Research Center published a survey in 2013 that showed that the number of adults attending religious services across Canada is dropping. Now they counted the number of people who attended church services once per month. But here in Atlantic Canada, it dropped from 57 to 31% in 25 years. So that trend is pretty discouraging. It's also a call to action. What's a church to do, especially for men? Now, breakfasts are an important tool, I think, that we can use to reach out to men. The form that the ministry takes can vary, but eggs, bacon, and God are usually involved. Now, my hypothesis is that a men's breakfast ministry can be a transformational event in the lives of men. And my research grows out of that hypothesis. If a church sets up the right men's breakfast ministry with the right elements in place, can it facilitate the transformational work of the Holy Spirit? So here's my research question. What elements lead to a men's breakfast ministry that offers an opportunity for spiritual development, relationship building, and outreach? It's designed to test my hypothesis. And the results I'm presenting today are a response to that question. And I've chosen to study the men's breakfasts in 2 Anglican parishes in the Halifax area. They are, as you will find out, 2 very different breakfasts. Grounded theory guided my research because there's really no model to help understand the data or to explain it. And grounded theory offers a way to discover the key elements of a men's breakfast from the experience of participants. And my goal is to understand men's breakfasts and develop practical ways to make them better. My 6 participants offered a very rich source of data. And certainly enough to discover clear themes that inform my question, suggest a substantive theory, and challenge my hypothesis. But because my sample size was small, I wanted to minimize my bias on the data by selecting participants without my direct involvement. So I had my research advisors select 2 parish sites that had long-standing breakfasts. I interviewed 3 people in each parish: the rector, a breakfast leader, and a breakfast participant, for a total of 6 people. The experience of men in the breakfasts, those who lead and those who participate, and the experience of priests that pastorally support the ministry are all important. Now, I contacted the rectors of the parish to request their participation and that of their breakfast leaderships, and I relied on the rector to provide me with a lay leader, and the lay leader to provide me with a participant. And that reduced my bias, but it also introduced another bias, but one that I thought I could control. The data I'll be presenting is from men who all know each other well. Our lens today will be from inside an urban Anglican parish in HRM. It's a very valid lens, but it most assuredly does not represent the experience of all breakfasts. And the context of my study then will place some limits on how far it can be generalized. But after that small digression, let's take a look at the research sites. I want to provide you with a picture of each breakfast drawn from my interview data. I have not personally attended or observed these breakfasts. What I'll describe is actually my impression of the collective experience of my respondents. St. Jude's breakfast starts and ends early. The core group of 8 to 10 men who prepare the meal arrive at 5. Food's ready by 7:30, and it's all done and cleaned up by 9. The core group is very stable. The breakfast is the only ministry dedicated to men in the parish. The men who attend are middle-aged and older. Guests are always welcome, including children and grandchildren, and the occasional woman. The food is fantastic, both the quantity and the quality. The servers are warm and friendly. The core group prepares and serves breakfast to about 40 people one Saturday a month. Not everyone comes every time, because if they did, they'd have over 100. And the traditional eggs, bacon, and hash browns, coffee, they're all available, but special surprises like fish cakes show up every once in a while. Now, for men, for many men, the breakfast is their only connection to St. Jude's. They're beginning to outnumber men who worship at St. Jude's on Sunday. And there are 2 identifiable groups among them: firemen and men from the local Roman Catholic parish. Now, there's no particular effort to reach out to these men, they just show up. Reaching out to men outside the parish isn't planned, it just happens. And the size of the breakfast is a measure of its success. Men come to eat well, reconnect with friends, and enjoy casual conversation. It's a low-key event with no significant demands on the participants. And according to Paul, a lay leader at St. Jude's, you gotta be careful about having an agenda. I don't think most guys want to go to a sing-song on Saturday morning. He was quite opinionated. St. Bart's breakfast varies from 10 to 20 men, all from the parish. They meet one Saturday a month. St. Bart's starts early too, but the cooking team might only be 1 person, depending on the Saturday. And the meal starts later at 8:30, and it lasts until cleanup, and it's finished around 10. And the core team at St. Bart's is about 3 to 4 people, but it relies heavily on the vision and dedication of 1 man and a pair of men who phone around to announce the breakfasts. And that breakfast started about a decade ago when a group of retired men decided that the men of the parish needed a way to meet and share their Christian journey just like the women. So they started a breakfast. About 2/3 of the men are retired. They love discussion and debate. Now, sometimes this has led to a clash of opinions, but all the men know each other. They all worship together at St. Bart's. The breakfast really doesn't attract outsiders. Now, food's not the highest priority at St. Bart's. Their emphasis is on speakers and discussing topical issues from a Christian perspective. A good speaker seems to increase the number of people who attend the breakfast. But the breakfast does provide a space for men in the parish to reconnect, to learn, to seek an intellectual challenge, and to grow in faith. Now, both St. Jude's and St. Bart's have sustained a men's breakfast ministry for many years, over a decade. Their apparent differences actually hide their similarities. It's clear from my interviews that the visions of both breakfasts share this idea to promote fellowship, a sense of community, and shared purpose. And they both bring men together to share a meal, to enter into dialogue, and to reconnect. They just use different strategies. Now, I found 5 themes in the data: fellowship, intentionality, intimacy, some notion of mission, and hints of spirituality. Fellowship was the most commonly used word, actually, to describe the men's breakfasts. Everyone used it, sometimes as a noun, sometimes as a verb. As a theme, it includes categories that take on the sense of what the group was, what the group experienced, and the activity in which they participated, fellowship. The theme reveals the importance of the shared experience, the desire to gather together and share together. The respondents used phrases laced with meaning to describe the action of fellowship. Breaking bread is a good example, something that calls to mind Jesus' actions at the Last Supper and the words of institution in the Eucharistic prayer. It's a sacred act. It's the detail of what they say where you find nuances that are really interesting. Themes come alive. And I was surprised how often the word reconnect appeared. They hardly ever used connect. It was always reconnect. And I think it's because reconnecting has a sense of meeting the familiar. There was an overwhelming preference to describe a key activity of fellowship as reconnecting. And I think this is a significant indicator of an inward focus to the fellowship, at least in the data that I have. The inward focus to fellowship is not surprising, since the methodology chosen to select respondents did rely on a cascade from rector to lay leader to lay participant. It all but guaranteed I had insiders for my questions and interviewing, but in itself, it's not a weakness in the data. It just means that my conclusions may not apply to all breakfasts. But even with the internal focus, external effects were apparent. I discussed this more fully under the mission theme. All respondents from both breakfasts held fellowship as an important, even critical dimension of their experience. Now, the next theme is intentionality. Intentionality holds many ideas together: the desire for structure, the freedom to choose, freedom from roles and expectation, and the need for core leadership. The dimensions of this theme include strategies, situational factors, and expressions of outcomes that all relate to the idea of going on a purposeful journey together, from one place to another as a group of Christian men. The theme also acknowledges or expresses an acknowledgement that action must be guided by a vision and purpose, that life together is within the broader community of the parish church. All the respondents were able to express their motivation for attending the breakfast. The men from each church shared a similar vision and purpose, but it varied between sites. St. Jude's was all about the food and a safe space to enjoy the company of friends. In St. Bart's, they rated conversation above food. But both parishes shared a common desire to meet and to share time together as men. Intentionality also speaks to a collective desire for safe space for the journey. The ordained and lay leadership in both cases were aware of the group's spoken, or in some cases unspoken, need for safe space. St. Jude's offers freedom from role and control, and St. Bart's provides space to explore life's issues from a male Christian perspective. My next theme is intimacy. Intimacy is linked to fellowship because the two themes express the breadth and the depth of relationships, respectively. Intimacy expresses a desire for men to go deep and take a risk with their lives. The men expressed the theme with words like connectedness, trust, supporting, and family, and ideas like prayer and invitation. Band of brothers is a useful metaphor I found for the sense of togetherness, connectedness, and family that they kind of expressed, by all of them expressed. Intimacy requires being authentic in relationships with others, and it takes time and trust to develop. It's not surprising to find this desire for intimacy because God created human beings in the image and likeness of God. And the capacity and the desire to express the intimate perichoretic nature of the triune God lies within us all. While all respondents were able to express the importance of relationship in terms of fellowship, men were challenged to communicate concepts of intimacy. Though respondents indicated the desire for intimate space, only half could articulate feelings about intimacy. When respondents were asked what it felt like to be at a breakfast, it was only the two priests, Luke and Matthew, and the participant Peter, that showed an ability to communicate feeling. The others struggled to express their experience in words. Intimacy is carefully built on a foundation of trust. The wider impact of the breakfast comes not from intimacy directly, but the strength that intimacy provides a band of brothers to reach out to other men. But it's a delicate balance to create intimacy within a group and still accept men into the fellowship and maintain the deepness of relationships. The third theme is mission. Mission has two possible dimensions: internal, directed to the people at the breakfasts, and external, by the breakfast group to the world. Now, both breakfasts had a strong internal focus and measured success, by and large, by numbers. This places the theme of mission and intimacy in some sort of tension. Some men may find intimacy difficult unless trusting relationships and a safe space are already established. And the pressure to add new men to an established group works against intimacy. This tension is important to consider when putting together and planning a men's breakfast ministry. Outreach is not part of the vision of either breakfast. Both St. Jude's and St. Bart's have an internal focus. The mission dimension is most obviously expressed by the core groups, who offer time and talent to other men in the parish. It's the nature of the church to have a mission dimension in all that we do. Now, St. Jude's breakfast is interesting. It attracts men from outside the parish, and they come in groups. Paul remarked that the outsiders outnumber the men from St. Jude's right now, and it has the leadership in a bit of a quandary. Outreach intentions not part of their vision, yet there's clearly an outreach effect. So the Spirit's working through the breakfasts and the men involved in that ministry. Paul's concerns about outsiders at the breakfast implies that this group might be considering revisiting their mission and purpose. It's an important reminder to be open to the Spirit's mission and God's intent for a ministry. At the same time, Matthew related a story of a new man to the parish who went to a breakfast, and he was like a stranger in a strange land. He was awkward and out of place because groupings were well established. Now this is the mission-intimacy tension. We have to remember, men's breakfast is church. For some of the men eating breakfast at St. Jude's, it's their only experience of church. It's a door into the Christian community and a safe place to keep them connected. It's a place where men can welcome others into community and make Christ known. The impact that a breakfast can have in a wider community is demonstrated by St. Jude's. And the strength and connectedness offered by a band of brothers provides witness and can be the strength for the group to reach out to others. Spirituality is my last theme. Now, the breakfasts all affected spirituality positively, and that's a significant outcome for a successful men's breakfast. Now, the men were challenged to directly answer questions about Christian spirituality, perhaps because spirituality is notoriously difficult to nail down today, but their answers all demonstrated life in the Spirit. For John, it's the deep sharing that stands out. Sharing time with believers is a constant and consistent spiritual theme. Fruit of the Spirit was evident at both sites. The meals had a sacramental sense for the priests and one participant. One respondent saw the men's breakfast as an outward sign of men's commitment to their faith community. The experience of a shared meal may be a simple act, but it holds profound spiritual meaning. A breakfast brings the material and spiritual together in the act of eating. Both body and soul are nourished. I identified 5 significant findings from my data. First, my data is not saturated. Many of the valuable contributions to the research are lone points, whose contribution would be strengthened by corroborating data. It's clear even from my sample of 2 breakfasts that no one recipe for breakfasts exists. It's not possible to generalize a conclusion from a 2 breakfast sample except to say that variation exists. But despite the lack of saturation, analysis reveals significant issues that can bear generalization and interesting points that provide insight. 5 clear themes were evident. Even in the small sample size, it's clear that intentionality is very important. Well-articulated vision, purpose, and goals, certainly among the leaders and core team, help focus a men's breakfast ministry. Vision and purpose guide plans and actions. It should come as no surprise that fellowship and intimacy, 2 dimensions of relationship, appear as themes of the breakfast. Mission is in tension with intimacy, and this will raise questions for any men's group seeking to kindle both depth and breadth in relationships. Tension can't be entirely resolved because intimate gatherings are difficult when men barely know one another. In my experience, it takes time for men to go deep. Striking a balance that supports a ministry's vision and purpose will be important. And at the same time, we need to be open to the Spirit. Now, it's a stereotype that men have difficulty discussing feelings and emotions. It's not true for everyone, but you know what? I did find it in my data. And it's, yeah, I did. In my experience, it takes time for men to go deep. Yeah. It was difficult for some of the men to discuss their feelings in the interview. And intimacy, that's a challenge. And any ministry hoping to transform the lives of men has to reach them at that emotional level. And it will need the right conditions and a safe place. And my data suggests that those conditions just might not be possible in a parish men's breakfast setting, especially one that brings men together only for 2 hours once a month. There are hints of a counter-thesis that I could develop, and even an antithesis. The counter-thesis would be that the men's breakfast would be an introductory ministry that holds men together in community in preparation for something else. Another opportunity that might be transformational. A number of indicators support this conclusion. The men don't compare their lone breakfast ministry very favorably with the women's ministries when they talked. Their expectations were lower. One man that described a transformational experience encountered it outside the men's breakfast ministry. And the breakfast I studied seemed to have their sights on keeping men connected to the Christian community and relying on other events to facilitate transformation. And there were hints that an antithesis could develop, which would be a sort of a move against any plans or activities to lead to transformational change. Now, what's not said is often more revealing than what is. And it didn't matter how often I asked the question and how many ways I tried to get to it. My research is missing any confirmation that a parish men's breakfast could be a transformational event. That doesn't discount the possibility that corroborating data exists, because the data set is definitely not saturated. But in the end, my research did not confirm my hypothesis. And it suggests that transformation might be a goal a bit too far to reach for a parish men's breakfast. So, what's a church to do? A church needs to identify a vision, and it needs a core leadership team to sustain a men's breakfast ministry. The data shows the importance of intentionality, and at the roots of intentionality are vision and guiding purpose. The guiding purpose helps with decisions when the path forward is not clear. Vision and purpose must be clear and yet still open to discernment. A clear and common vision and purpose ensures everyone's pulling together. The data indicates a significant tension between mission and intimacy. We're all called as Christians to spread the good news, yet this call to mission can sometimes conflict with a desire for intimacy in relationships. And being clear about the vision and purpose of the men's breakfast can help mitigate, I think, this tension. The Christian church has been a missional organization from the very beginning, and Jesus' Great Commission is clear. We of Christian faith have a responsibility to participate in spreading the good news. While every activity we do as a Christian community has this missional dimension, not every activity has to have that missional intention. It's entirely acceptable for a men's breakfast ministry to have this internal focus towards men in the parish. It takes time to build a trust and safe environment for close and intimate relationships to build. It's just not perhaps feasible when new people keep showing up all the time. Breakfasts will need to maintain that balance between mission and intimacy. And an exceptional breakfast may line them up so that the band of brothers can actually undertake a mission together and welcome men from the wider community. Now, the research question grew out of my conviction that men's breakfast could be a place where men's lives are radically transformed. The 2 breakfasts studied are not transformational in my respondents. I can deduce from the interviews that transformation was not really the stated goal of the breakfasts, and it wasn't really part of anyone's vision. But the surprising finding for me was hints that people were resistant to this transformational change, resistant to any attempts to try to encourage people to move that way. Expecting a men's breakfast to be a ministry of transformation may be a bar too high to reach. The breakfast studied were important ministries, but more as a place to share meals and conversation and to reconnect with friends and acquaintances. One respondent with experience of Cursillo, which is a men's retreat weekend, was clear that the length of time and frequency of a breakfast made transformation difficult. Considered more broadly, however, the men's breakfast could work with other ministries to achieve it. A breakfast could draw men in and encourage the conditions where a man might consider taking further steps in his faith journey. So I guess what this does is suggest that Christian communities should consider men's breakfasts not as just the only ministry, but one in a stable of men's ministries available. The 2 breakfasts investigated are stable, long-standing ministries, and they're not identical. A church looking for rules for a successful breakfast will be disappointed. The local situation and context plays a large part in shaping how a men's breakfast can meet a perceived need. A breakfast particularly designed to reach out to unchurched men would be different from a breakfast designed to gather men who already worship together. The strategies used to encourage breakfasts may be different, but the goal of breaking bread and conversing together on a shared journey is shared. The best strategy depends on where men are on their journey, and it also depends on other influences bearing on the community. Context and local conditions will determine the best way to make a breakfast work. And leaders will need to be attentive to what happens and use feedback to adjust their strategy. Think of breakfasts as a living social system that needs to adapt to survive in different conditions. Now, all this time I'm sure you're wondering what the elements of a successful men's breakfast are. My approach used a grounded theory. Most of my time was spent trying to understand what the heck a men's breakfast was. Okay? Once I got to that point, then the question becomes, so what? What's the answer to the question? What are the elements that really make a men's breakfast work? Well, here's the answer that came from the data and my analysis. A guiding vision and purpose, a dedicated leader and core team, a good understanding of the local context and environment, safe space for relationships to form and strengthen, an openness to the Spirit's mission, and an expectation that simple acts will have profound meaning. Now, I can tell you, after working for like 9 months on this answer seems obvious to me, okay? But if only it was that simple. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Questions or comments for David Peer?
Thank you, David. I'm just wondering if you got any sense from either your own research or the interviewees. You mentioned that one was like speaker-centered, and the other was more relational fellowship-centered. Because it strikes me that if one of the speakers was John Wesley, one of the speakers was St. Paul, there might be more opportunity for transformation.
It might be, but I don't think you would have got any more men at St. Jude's. No, but
there's no distinction whatsoever between the speaker emphasis and the non-speaker emphasis in terms of generating broadening of horizons, fellowship, testimony to be shared, support people in their faith journeys, and so on and so forth.
they were like opposite poles. That's what it felt like, opposite poles on a spectrum. Now, maybe that's being a bit too extreme, but the experience that different people, like, first of all, to understand, I took views at both the pastor, the leader, and the participant level. So it's hard to integrate all those different pieces. But the speakers, there's a resistance to having that kind of input at one of the breakfasts because that's not what they felt they needed or they wanted. And in the other place, that's exactly what they wanted. So that the challenge is, how do you, if you feel that that's not where they need to be, and how do you get them here? It's okay, but you might be the only person coming to the breakfast in the morning. So I suppose if it was St. Paul, but I don't know if that answers your question or not. But yeah.
Thanks, David. I'm becoming increasingly aware of the importance of ministry with men in my own ministry. I'm wondering, did you discover anything about the ages of, are these breakfasts attracting younger men? Did any of that information go in down?
The men that were coming to the breakfast were retired, I'd say down to maybe 35. The challenge that you have is you have a group of people who have a vision and purpose. If their vision and purpose was to bring in men from 25 to 35, Saturday morning would probably not be the time to have that breakfast. No, seriously. I mean, you're getting men with children or men that are retired, but that's a time in the day when they can be in. So it wasn't stated by the virtue of what they were doing. It wasn't who they were going to get, but this gets to that mission intimacy piece. So if you're going to have a mission to men that are 25 to 35, you need to find another group of men, probably not 25 to 35 unless they exist in your parish, that can actually find when you need to have the breakfast and be that core group that provides the mission to those people. And I think the breakfasts that I interviewed, they weren't at that point. They were more into intimacy and getting the friends together so that they could do things that they saw their wives doing. I mean, one of the respondents, one of the things they got upset about was they kept coming back, their wives kept coming back from meetings telling them what was going on in the parish, and they felt that they needed to meet together to have some connection and know what was going on. It's this comparison piece, so depends on what your intention is. Yep.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if any of them spoke about why they started the men's breakfast, perhaps, or if that was rather
Share a little bit about that. I didn't include it in my presentation, but in St. Jude's, they had a men's breakfast ministry that had fairly long-standing, that in the end kind of imploded. And one of the reasons why it imploded, I think, was that there was outside direction trying to get men to do things, so men just stopped coming. But after a couple of years, a core group of people got together and said, you know what, we need to have this fellowship. So they had another men's breakfast. And I think that may have been part of why they were so resistant to having having speakers come in and telling them what they had to do. Their safe space was freedom from role and control. Okay? And that's something that you'll see. If you look in the literature, like Bly's book, The Iron John, came out in the 1990s, one of the things in the mythopoetic movement for men is so that men can let go of the stereotypes that society imposes on them. So they come into this breakfast and they can let that go. The last thing they want to do is have to keep that persona on when they're going into a breakfast. So I think that was in St. Jude's. In St. Bart's, there was this interesting story about the women knew more about what was going on than they did. And you know, they'd meet people in church, they'd meet other men in church, but they really didn't know them. But yet, when they got together, what kept them together, what kept them communicating, was their discussions and their talking, and it wasn't so much the food, it was the chance to communicate.
I was wondering, thanks.
Okay.
If a person happened to be a female priest in a parish, as looking around the room looks like it could happen, and how would is there a way that a female priest could support or initiate a ministry like this? Or would that be sort of like women telling them what to do, which sounds like something they weren't really keen on?
I think it would be unfair to say that a woman priest would be seen any different than a male priest if they said it wants to be done. I think the question is lifting people up in their work. So you need to find the core team and support them. If the core team thinks that they need a priest at the dinner, I don't think it makes a difference whether it's a man or a woman, because the role that the priest would provide at that dinner would, you know, you could join it as a man, take the collar off, or keep the collar on. And I think if you were going as a woman priest, you'd keep the collar on. It's not like they were resistant to having women there. It's just that it's clear from my literature survey that men and women can meet together and do things, but there is certain language that men can speak to other men that it seems like only men really understand. But it doesn't require a priest to come there and participate in that language. You need to facilitate it. You need to hold up the leaders to do that. So I think it certainly reinforces the message that I had in how to do a men's breakfast, is to have that core team. And I think whether you're a man or a woman priest, you want to support that core team. You do not want to run the breakfast yourself. A male priest wouldn't want to run the breakfast themselves. If that answers your question.
Just a quick story. Many years back, when I was in my 20s starting out, and I went to a church, and I was the first woman pastor that they had, associate pastor that they had. The men came to me and invited me to their men's breakfast, and they said to me, "We're going to break our 40-year-old rule, no women allowed, and invite you to our breakfast." And I was deeply humbled by that. And I did go, but I felt like when I was there, they were talking about, well, who won the football game and that kind of stuff, because that's what the expectation. I could talk about that, but they weren't sharing, you know, their pastoral concerns that they would have, and I thought it was.
David, I have two questions for you.
Okay.
One, the first question is, you talked about the one church that had speakers. Were the speakers intended to be speakers hoping for transformation, or were they sort of how to buy a car and that?
They were speakers. It could be social justice. It could be on just any, it could be topics like the Ivany Report. But the discussion that ensued was an attempt to discuss this from a Christian perspective that the men might not hear in the news or in community.
So more applied theology than,
I would say, yeah.
than transformation.
Yep.
My second question is, so when you start a men's breakfast,
Would I start a men's breakfast?
what would you do?
What would I do? If I was the pastor of a parish, I wouldn't attempt to start one myself. But if there wasn't one there, I'd want to know why, especially if there were no other men's breakfasts. But depending on what you wanted to do with the breakfast, you need a core group. And that core group may not actually come from within the parish. Well, there may be men in the parish, but they may be informed on this kind of mission work by something else. Alpha, involvement in Alpha, perhaps involvement in Curcio. But you need people who are willing to do that mission work for the people in the parish and build them up. But in the end, if your goal is to have a group of men that are willing to go out into the community and do things, I mean, that could be years. But I think I would be beating myself to death trying to get something started if the men in the congregation were not ready for that. Yeah.
Do they pray?
Do they pray? Yes, they do. But it's not, there's a video on YouTube. No, there's a video, it's called the mushroom prayer. All the men get together and they kind of, like a huddle in a football game. They don't do that. There's grace at breakfast, at the beginning and at the end. Sometimes there are prayers in the data that people admitted that when someone had a problem, they might get together with someone and pray for them. But it's not like, okay, time to stop eating, it's prayer time. That really wasn't it. So when I was trying to analyze the data, it was like if there could be safe spaces within the breakfast where one or two men could get together, maybe off in a corner, and they could talk about it. And we have to remember that the formal prayer that we see in church, that's not necessarily the only way you can pray. Just being able to know that you're talking to another Christian and laying your problems out to them, Christ is in you. You're talking to God when you're talking to this person. And in a lot of cases, all you got to do is listen. So just creating that space where that can happen, that's a big step for a lot of men. It really is. Yeah. So I see prayer maybe where some people might not see prayer.
Thank you, David. An observation and then a question. One is that I'm thinking that in another practical research or another observation with experience in ministry, you might encounter a third model for the men's breakfast, and that is the mission project-based breakfast. You have those that are open, have no speakers. You have those that are speakers and learning oriented, but then you have those that organize around not obligatory participation in a project, but there is some focused discussion at the breakfast, and then those who want to join in, whether it's, I'm thinking of my own experience, insulating a new building at the church camp, or and if there's a project that they want to consider as next year's project, and there's someone local who can speak about it, then a speaker that is related to the project. But the sort of seasonal focus is actually activity-based.
I've seen that. Yeah.
The question actually relates to your concern about not seeing signs that the breakfast can be transformational. I wonder if, in fact, you are setting your bar a little too high, and some of the things you identified are, in fact, given what we know about how long it takes for men to come to intimacy, to talk about the matters of spirituality, that some of the things you observed are, in fact, not transformational, but are, in fact, agents of transformation a step at a time. What do you think?
I actually agree with you. I'm a living example. The problem is I got to work with the data I got. And within the data, there wasn't, in my opinion, it wasn't that obvious. Now, it depends on how you define that transformational, absolutely. Just keeping someone connected to a community of Christians who has no Christian family or Christian connections may in fact be transformational. It could be, absolutely.
You know, for an adult male church member who perhaps until you were interviewed and had a chance to reflect on the experience of breakfast, has never felt he had the vocabulary to speak up in any other setting than the church, to be able to speak to you in sacramental terms of breaking bread together, perhaps that is evidence of transformation. That's just what it says.
Yep.
Does it have to be bacon and eggs? Can it be quiche and fruit salad? Or...
You can keep writing.